So there is some hope for commercial and small-scale fishers who've been heavily affected by tighter lockdown restrictions on the fishing of West Coast Rock Lobster. Environmental Affairs and Fisheries Minister Barbara Creecy announced plans to review the 600-ton total allowable catch for the upcoming season. A newly appointed Consultative Advisory Forum is tasked with ensuring that the review is completed within the next 2 weeks. For more on these plans, let's bring in the Minister who joins us now via our video link. And Minister Creecy, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for speaking to us. This, to some people hearing about it for the first time, sounds like a very industry-specific issue. So perhaps let's begin with much-needed context. What is it about these regulations that were problematic, and why is it necessary for them to be reviewed, especially with small-scale fishers in mind?
Greetings, Ayanda, and greetings to all of your viewers at home. I think where we need to start is by recognizing that fishing generally is a major industry in our country. It employs over 28,000 people, and of course we have several thousand small-scale fishers throughout the country who have been allocated 15-year rights. That process is still in motion in the Western Cape, where approximately 2,000 small-scale fishers will ultimately be allocated 15-year fishing rights. And of course, West Coast Rock Lobster is a high-value species. These small-scale fishermen and, of course, the industry itself were looking forward to recouping some of the losses that they experienced during the COVID pandemic. Although fishing was allowed during all levels of lockdown, I think the difficulty was that the international markets where this rock lobster was sold were not available, and so many people suffered losses as a result.
Yeah.
Now, what we understand is as a result of climate change and also overfishing in the past, this sector, like many of our fisheries, is under pressure. And when the Scientific Working Committee made this recommendation, they were looking at how the stock can recover, and they were suggesting this decrease in the allowable catch. Of course, I visited a whole number of small-scale fishing communities over the past week. They are raising questions about the veracity of the scientific evidence that was put before our Scientific Working Committee. The industry are raising questions about the estimations of poaching that was put before the Scientific Working Committee. And my view is that if there are question marks over the credibility of a process, it's very important that this evidence is laid out in the public domain and that it is reviewed with a view to finding out whether it's an appropriate decision or whether a different decision should be taken.
Right. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the Consultative Advisory Forum through which some of these changes could be made is a relatively new panel. It involves, I think, both local and international fisheries and conservation groups. Help us place the role that they play in this process.
Well, I think that if you are going to review scientific evidence, you require a fresh panel of scientists to look at it. You and I, Ayanda, can listen to communities, we can hear grievances, we can hear upset, but what we require is a panel, a fresh panel of scientists to look at what was the original evidence. We also want to create an opportunity for representatives of both the commercial industry and the small-scale sector to make further representations. They believe that they have relevant evidence that the committee needs to hear. And obviously, once they've been through this process, I think you don't have your timeframes correct. I think we're hoping to conclude this process by early in December.
Right.
I don't think it will take 2 weeks. But they would then be able to apply their minds as to whether, given all of the circumstances and evidence before them, this decision needs to be reviewed or whether it needs to be confirmed.
And I imagine the thin line to tread here is around ensuring that there's increased compliance with regulations that look to combat things like overfishing and poaching, but also ensuring that that doesn't hit small-scale farmers because of an unintended consequence?
Yes, I think that we are all very worried about the scale of poaching. We work together with something called Operation Phakisa 5. Obviously, you would understand I don't run a police force, but we do have enforcement officials that would be coordinating and cooperating with the South African Police Services. But I think it's generally agreed that this aspect of policing work, like other aspects, is understaffed. And we are constantly looking at ways that we can enhance anti-poaching operations, because if you have illegal catch, it's obviously depriving those who have rights of their legal right to benefiting from this resource.
Right. Well, Minister, whilst I have you on the line, and in fact you've also referenced issues around climate change as well, allow me to take the liberty to also just get your thoughts as the Minister in charge of Environmental Affairs, where you think government plays a role in the upcoming COP26 summit, which of course has garnered international interest because of what's at stake. So much attention being given to government's efforts throughout the world to try and reduce our carbon footprint because of the goals we've set ourselves as a planet, really, to try to combat climate change. Help us place where government's voice actually fits in that, given our reliance on non-renewable resources like coal to generate things like electricity.
Well, obviously, as you say, the South African government has committed itself to doing its best effort to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our country is primarily dependent on coal-fired energy generation. 90% of our power comes from coal-fired power stations. And I think that over the next 10 years, Eskom has put a plan on the table to ramp up renewable generation and to slowly decommission coal-fired power stations. This is important not only because we have a moral duty to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but because the international investments in new green technology also potentially pose either a risk or an opportunity to our economy. If all our goods and services are being produced under an environment of only coal-fired power stations, they will become less competitive as our major trading partners introduce carbon border tariffs. So what I'm saying is there's both a physical climate risk reason why we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also an economic risk. But the way we approach this has to be in a manner that ensures energy security and helps us to solve the problems of energy poverty and lack of generation going forward.
Do you reckon that these plans are moving fast enough? I mean, you speak of Eskom slowly decommissioning some of those coal-powered fire stations, but of course, one thing about climate change is that it's a race against time, at least if the effects are anything to go by.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, and I think the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has indicated that we do need to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030 if we're to avoid these catastrophic consequences going further into our century. But I think the fundamental issue for us in South Africa is whether we can secure the right financial mix of grant, concessional and investment financing that will enable us to transition Eskom. I think we know that we have debt problems in our country. We also know that the Eskom balance sheet is not the strongest balance sheet. And so part of what we will be doing informally as we go to COP26 is looking for opportunities to source appropriate finances so that we can support this transition.
Minister Barbara Creecy, that's the time we have for our discussion. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. Environmental Affairs and Fisheries Minister Barbara Creecy joining us there for that discussion.